A millionaire wakes from a 5-year coma and tells the nurse who cared for him something terrible. At the height of his success, Frank Morrison was the living image of the American dream. From his humble origins in a small town, he had built a business empire spanning from technology to real estate. His name was synonymous with power. His face adorned the covers of business magazines, and his fortune was the object of envy and speculation. The Morrison Mansion, an imposing structure of marble and glass atop a hill overlooking the ocean, was the tangible symbol of his triumph. Within its walls, 3 children grew up surrounded by luxury and privilege. Daniel, the eldest, an astute but impulsive businessman; Catherine, the middle child, brilliant and ambitious; and Jessica, the youngest, charismatic and manipulative. Frank had raised them to be strong, to continue his legacy. He had given them everything: the best education, unlimited opportunities, and the promise of a golden future. But in his eagerness to build an empire, he had neglected something fundamental, teaching them the value of empathy and compassion. The fateful day came without warning. During a crucial business meeting, Frank collapsed. The diagnosis was devastating: a brain aneurysm that plunged him into a deep coma. Overnight, the titan of business was reduced to a motionless body in a hospital bed. The doctors were pessimistic. "Prepare for the worst," they warned the family. "It's unlikely he'll wake up, and if he does, he may never be the same again." As Frank lay unconscious, connected to machines that kept his body alive, his children faced a new reality. Suddenly, the empire their father had built was in their hands. The fortune they would one day inherit had become a due, tangible and tempting possibility. At first, there was a period of shock and genuine concern. Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica took turns visiting their father in the hospital, hoping against all hope that he would open his eyes. But as the days passed, then the weeks, and finally the months, something began to change. The Morrison Mansion, once full of life and activity, became a somber place. Laughter was replaced by whispers, family gatherings by tense meetings full of suspicious glances. In the marble hallways and under the majestic chandeliers, plans and conspiracies began to be woven. Daniel was the first to break the silence on what everyone was thinking. One night, while sharing a tense dinner in the main dining room, he dropped the question that would change everything. "What will happen to the company if Dad doesn't wake up?" Catherine, always the most pragmatic, responded coldly, "We'll have to take control. We can't let everything he's built crumble." Jessica, the youngest but perhaps the shrewdest, added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "We should start planning for Dad's sake, of course." That night marked the beginning of a new era in the Morrison family. What began as a genuine concern for the future of the family empire soon turned into an unbridled race for control and power. Meanwhile, in the quietness of his hospital room, Frank Morrison lay motionless. His body was in a coma, but his mind was about to embark on a journey that would change not only his life, but the lives of all those around him. Frank Morrison's world had been reduced to darkness and silence, or at least that's what everyone believed. In reality, while his body remained immobile, his mind was in a strange state of semi-consciousness. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, but he could hear, and what he heard was breaking his heart. At first, the voices were confusing, as if coming from far away, fragments of conversations, muffled sobs, the constant beeping of machines. Little by little, his mind began to clear, and the voices became sharper. "Dad, if you can hear me, please wake up," he heard Catherine say one day. Her voice sounded broken, full of an emotion Frank hadn't heard in years. For a moment, he felt a warmth in his heart. But then, "Catherine, did you talk to the lawyer?" Daniel's voice interrupted the moment. "We need to know how the will is structured." "Daniel, please, now is not the time," Catherine replied, but her tone had changed. There was no longer emotion, just cold determination. "It's never the time, is it?" Jessica chimed in, "But months have passed. We have to be realistic." Frank wanted to scream, to tell them he was there, that he could hear them, but his body refused to respond. He could only listen, helpless, as his children discussed his fortune as if he were already dead. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The visits became less frequent, but the conversations he heard became increasingly calculating. "I've been reviewing the company books," he heard Catherine say on one occasion. "There are some investments we could liquidate without anyone noticing. It would give us a good cushion while we wait for him to die." Daniel's voice sounded irritated. "Say it like it is, Catherine. We're all thinking it." "Don't be so crude," Jessica interjected, but her tone suggested more annoyance at the lack of tact than at the content. "But he's right, Catherine. We need a plan. We can't keep living in this limbo." Frank felt his heart breaking up a little more with each conversation. Where were the children he had raised? The little ones who ran into his arms when he came home from work, who asked him to tell them stories before bed. At what point had they turned into these cold, calculating adults? Nurses came and went, changing his sheets, adjusting his medications. Sometimes they talked among themselves, commenting on the poor millionaire and how sad it was to see a family crumbling like this. "It's a shame," he heard a young nurse say. "So much money and they can't even pretend to care about their father." "Money doesn't buy love, honey," an older nurse replied. "Sometimes it even destroys it." Those words resonated in Frank's mind. Had it been the money? Had his obsession with building an empire corrupted his children? Or had they always been like this, and he had been too blind to see it? One night, he heard Jessica softly sobbing by his bed. For a moment, he felt hope. Perhaps after all there was still something left of the girl he had raised. "Oh, Dad," Jessica whispered through tears. "Why did you have to get sick now? I had so many plans. I need you to wake up. I need you to sign those documents for the new subsidiary. Everything is falling apart without you." Frank's heart sank. Even his youngest daughter's tears were tinged with ambition and greed. As the years passed, Frank became a silent witness to the disintegration of his family. He heard plans, conspiracies, mutual accusations. Daniel wanted to sell parts of the company. Catherine insisted on maintaining control. Jessica played both sides, allying with one or the other as it suited her. "If Dad doesn't wake up soon, I'll take control myself," he heard Daniel say in a heated discussion. "You two have no idea how to handle an empire like this." "You? Please," Catherine's voice dripped with contempt. "Your gambling debts are public knowledge. You'd ruin everything in months." "At least I'm not diverting company funds for my own projects," Daniel shot back. "Enough," Jessica shouted. "If you keep this up, there won't be anything left when Dad—" She stopped, but the silence that followed was more eloquent than any word they were all waiting for, the same thing: his death. In the darkness of his mind, Frank Morrison made a decision. If he ever woke up, things would have to change. The empire he had built, the fortune he had treasured so much, meant nothing now. His children had shown their true nature, and it was time for them to face the consequences. But for now, all he could do was listen, learn, and wait. Wait for an opportunity to correct the biggest mistake of his life, having raised his children to value money above everything else. 5 years, 1,825 days of darkness, distant voices, and cold hearts. To the outside world, Frank Morrison was little more than a body connected to machines, a living reminder of how ephemeral power can be. But inside that seemingly sleeping mind, a storm was brewing. It was on a morning like any other when the impossible happened. Frank's fingers, motionless for so long, moved slightly. His eyelids, heavy as lead, began to tremble, and then, against all odds, his eyes opened. The room was empty, except for a nurse routinely checking his vital signs. When she saw those brown eyes, once full of determination and now confused, she almost dropped the folder she was holding. "Doctor, doctor," she shouted, running towards the hallway. "Mr. Morrison has woken up." In a matter of minutes, the room, filled with doctors and nurses, bright lights moved in front of his eyes. Voices asked him questions he could barely process. His throat, unused for so long, could only emit a weak grunt. "Mr. Morrison, if you can understand me, blink twice," said the chief doctor, leaning over him. Frank blinked slowly and deliberately twice. A smile formed on the doctor's face. "It's a miracle," he muttered, before turning to his team. "Call the family, immediately." As the medical staff moved frantically around him, performing tests and adjusting equipment, Frank's mind struggled to catch up. 5 years. He had been absent for 5 years. What was left of his empire? What was left of his family? The following hours were a whirlwind of medical examinations and intensive therapies. His body, weakened by years of inactivity, refused to cooperate. Every movement was a struggle, every word a challenge. But Frank Morrison hadn't built an empire by giving up in the face of challenges. It was almost nightfall when he heard familiar voices in the hallway, voices he had heard for years, but which now provoked a mixture of love and revulsion. Is it true? Has he really woken up? Catherine's voice, always practical. It must be a mistake. The doctors said it was impossible. Daniel, skeptical as always. Well, if it's true, it changes everything. Jessica, already calculating the implications. Frank closed his eyes, preparing for the encounter. When the door opened, he pretended to be asleep, listening as his children cautiously entered the room. "Dad," Catherine's voice sounded shaky. "Can you hear us?" Slowly, Frank opened his eyes. He saw the faces of his children, a mixture of shock, relief, and was that concern in their eyes? Or were they simply calculating how this would affect their plans? "My children," he managed to say, his voice hoarse from disuse. The three approached the bed, Daniel taking his hand, Catherine stroking his forehead, Jessica softly sobbing. "I can't believe it," said Daniel. "The doctors said it was impossible. We knew you were strong, Dad," added Catherine. But there was a tremor in her voice that Frank couldn't decipher. "We've missed you so much," sobbed Jessica. But even in his weakened state, Frank could see the calculation behind those tears. He wanted to confront them. He wanted to scream that he knew everything, that he had heard every greedy conversation, every selfish plan. But something stopped him. A voice inside advised caution. "Observe," it told him. "Learn." The truth always comes to light. So Frank Morrison, the man who had once been known for his business acumen, decided to play the most important game of his life. He feigned weakness, confusion, as if the last 5 years were a blank space in his memory. What happened?" Frank asked weakly, playing the role of a confused and disoriented man. The three siblings exchanged quick glances, a mixture of relief and something darker that Frank couldn't fully decipher. "You've been in a coma, Dad," explained Catherine, her voice soft but controlled. "For 5 years, you had an aneurysm during a business meeting." 5 years. Frank feigned disbelief, although every second of those 5 years was etched in his memory. "Yes, Dad," Daniel intervened, squeezing his hand with what seemed to be genuine affection. "But don't worry. We've kept everything under control. The company is fine." Jessica, always the most emotional, or at least the best actress, leaned in to kiss her father's forehead. "The important thing is that you're back with us. We've missed you so much." Frank closed his eyes, feigning exhaustion. "I need to rest," he murmured. "Of course, Dad," said Catherine, taking control as always. "Rest. We'll be here when you wake up." When the door closed behind them, Frank opened his eyes, his gaze now sharp and calculating. The game had begun. The following days were a whirlwind of medical examinations, therapies, and emotional visits from his children. Frank observed every gesture, every word, every look they exchanged when they thought he wasn't watching. Daniel showed up every morning with reports on the state of the company, talking about decisions he had made, contracts he had closed. "Everything is under control, Dad. You have nothing to worry about." Catherine, for her part, focused on his recovery. She brought specialists, consulted with doctors, organized his rehabilitation. "You'll be as good as new soon, Dad, and then we can discuss the future of the company." Jessica was the hardest to read. One day she would arrive with tears in her eyes, talking about how much she had missed him. The next, he would catch her quietly discussing financial decisions with her siblings. Meanwhile, Frank played his role to perfection. He feigned weakness when they were present, but in private, he worked tirelessly to regain his strength. At night, when the nurse on duty thought he was asleep, he did exercises to strengthen his atrophied muscles. One afternoon, while pretending to sleep, he heard his children arguing in the hallway. "We have to tell him about the sale of the technology division," Daniel whispered. "Are you crazy?" Catherine replied. "He's barely recovering, we can't stress him with that now." "But if he finds out from another—" "Source," Jessica began. "He won't find out," Catherine interrupted, "at least not until we're sure of his mental state. For now we continue as Before Smiles, support, and not a word about the changes in the company." Frank had to use all his self-control not to react. Sale of the technology division. That had been the jewel of his empire. What else had they done in his absence? As the weeks passed, Frank began to show signs of improvement. He could sit up in bed, maintain longer conversations, even take short walks around the room. His children celebrated each achievement, but he could see the growing concern in their eyes. They knew they would soon have to face reality. It was during one of these walks that Frank decided to make his first move, pretending to stumble. He leaned on the bedside table, accidentally knocking over some papers Catherine had left. "There, oh, I'm sorry," he mumbled, slowly bending to pick them up. "Don't worry, Dad," Catherine said quickly, snatching the documents away. "I'll take care of it." But she wasn't fast enough. Frank had seen enough. They were financial reports, and the figures didn't match what Daniel had been telling him. "Catherine," he said in a weak but curious voice, "what are those papers?" "Nothing important, Dad," she replied with a forced smile. "Just some routine reports." "I'd like to see them," Frank insisted. "After all, I'm still the owner of the company, aren't I?" The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine looked at Daniel, who in turn looked at Jessica. The three seemed to be having a silent conversation, deciding what to say, what to hide. "Of course you are, Dad," Daniel finally said, his voice full of false cheerfulness. "But the doctors say you shouldn't stress yourself. Why don't you rest a bit? We can discuss the company tomorrow." Frank nodded, feigning resignation. "You're right, I'm tired. Tomorrow will be another day." As his children left the room, visibly relieved, Frank lay back in his bed, a small smile playing on his lips. The first move had been made. Now it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. In the quietness of his hospital room, the former titan of business began to plan his next move. The game had just begun, and Frank Morrison was determined to win, not for money or power, but for something much more valuable: the truth and perhaps the redemption of his family. As the days passed, Frank continued his act of gradual recovery, while secretly gathering information. Each visit from his children, every whispered conversation in the hallways, every document carelessly left in sight, all became pieces of the puzzle he was assembling. One morning, he decided it was time to push a little harder. When Daniel entered with his usual morning report, Frank interrupted him. "Son," he said firmly, surprising Daniel with his tone, "I want to see the company books, all of them." Daniel visibly paled. "Dad, I don't think this is the right time. You're still recovering, and—" "I'm recovered enough to understand numbers, Daniel," Frank insisted. "I built this empire. I think I can handle a little paperwork." Before Daniel could respond, Catherine entered the room. Sensing the tension in the air, she quickly intervened. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze passing from her father to her brother. "Dad wants to see the company books," Daniel explained, his voice tense. Catherine maintained her composure, but Frank noticed how her hands tensed slightly. "Dad, I understand you want to catch up, but don't you think it's a bit soon?" The doctors say I'm progressing admirably," Frank interrupted, "and as CEO of Morrison Enterprises, I have the right to see those books, unless, of course, there's something you don't want me to see." The silence that followed was revealing. Catherine and Daniel exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Catherine spoke. "Of course not, Dad. It's just that a lot has happened in 5 years. We wanted to wait until you were fully recovered so as not to overwhelm you." Frank softened his expression, returning to his role of convalescent father. "I understand your concern, But I need to know. This company is my life. Please bring me those books." Resigned, Catherine and Daniel nodded. "You'll have them tomorrow, Dad," Catherine promised. That night, Frank could barely sleep, and he knew that what he would see in those books wouldn't be the whole truth. His children would have time to touch up the figures, hide the most questionable transactions, but even an edited version would give him clues about what had really happened. The next morning, his 3 children arrived with boxes full of documents for hours. Frank reviewed reports, balance sheets, and projections, while his children waited nervously. "I see you've been busy," he finally commented, his tone neutral. "We did the best we could, Dad," Jessica said, speaking for the first time. "It wasn't easy without you." Frank nodded slowly. "There are some interesting decisions here. The sale of the technology division, for example. That was the future of the company." The 3 siblings visibly tensed. "It was a difficult decision, Dad," Daniel explained, "but we needed the capital to expand into other sectors." "I see," Frank murmured. "And these investments in offshore companies, I don't remember we had so many before." Catherine quickly intervened. "Diversification, Dad. It's a strategy to protect our assets." Frank looked at each of them, his eyes penetrating. He could see the fear in their looks, the anxiety in their postures. He knew that what he had in front of him was just the tip of the iceberg. "You've done an interesting job," he finally said. "But I think I need time to process all this. Could you leave me alone for a moment?" With evident relief, his children left the room. Once alone, Frank dropped his mask of calm. The anger and disappointment he had been containing threatened to overflow. What he had seen in those documents was only a fraction of the truth, but it was enough to confirm his worst fears. His empire, built with decades of hard work and sacrifice, had been looted and manipulated by those he trusted most. But he couldn't lose control now. He needed more information. He needed a plan. And above all, he needed to get out of that hospital. That night, as the nurse made her nightly rounds, Frank made a decision. It was time to speed things up. With a determination he hadn't felt in years, he began to plan his next move. The game was about to change, and Frank Morrison was ready to regain control. The night was dark and silent when Frank Morrison executed his plan. For weeks he had observed the hospital routines, memorizing the nurses' shifts, the moments when the corridors were deserted. He had worked tirelessly to regain his strength, performing exercises in secret when no one was watching. With careful movements, he got out of bed and dressed in the clothes he had asked his children to bring him. For when they discharged him, he took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to do was risky but necessary. Stealthily, he opened the door of his room and peered into the hallway, empty. With cautious but determined steps, Frank began his escape. Every few meters he stopped, listening, making sure no one was approaching. He reached the elevator and pressed the button. The seconds it took to arrive seemed eternal. Once inside, he let out a sigh of relief. The hardest part was over. On the ground floor, he walked naturally towards the exit, as if he were a visitor leaving after visiting hours. The security guard barely glanced at him as he walked out the main doors. The fresh night air hit him like a revelation. 5 years. 5 years since, he had breathed the air of the outside world. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed by the sensation of freedom. But there was no time to waste. Frank began to walk, moving away from the hospital. He had no clear destination in mind. He just knew he needed time and space to think, away from the watchful eyes of his children and the medical staff. He walked for what seemed like hours, his muscles protesting from the effort after so much inactivity. The city streets were almost deserted at this time of night, which he was grateful for. He didn't want to be recognized, not yet. It was then that he saw him, a man sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in a tattered blanket, with a cardboard sign at his feet that read, "Any help is welcome. God bless you." Frank stopped. Something in that man's gaze, a mixture of resignation and dignity, captivated him. Without thinking twice, he approached and sat down next to him. The man looked at him surprised. "Good evening, sir," he said in a hoarse but kind voice. "Good evening," Frank replied. "Do you mind if I sit here for a moment?" "Not at all," said the man, gesturing with his hand. "The sidewalk belongs to everyone." They remained silent for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Frank spoke. "What's your name?" he asked. "Martin," the man replied. "And you?" Frank hesitated for a second. "Edward," he lied, not wanting to reveal his true identity. Martin nodded, without asking any more questions. There was something in his attitude, a quiet acceptance of circumstances, that Frank found comforting. "How long have you been on the street?" Frank asked. Martin sighed. 3 years, lost my job, then my house. You know how it is." Frank felt a pang of guilt. Here he was, a man who had had it all, sitting next to someone who had nothing. And yet Martin seemed to possess an inner peace that Frank envied. "And how do you manage?" Frank asked. Genuinely interested. Martin shrugged. "Day by day it's not easy, but you learn to appreciate the little things. A sunny day, a kind smile, a warm meal. They're things I used to take for granted." Frank nodded, reflecting on Martin's words. When was the last time he had appreciated those little things? "And you?" Martin asked. "You don't seem to be having your best moment." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "It's a long story." "Well," Martin said with a smile, "it seems we have all night." And so, under the cover of night, Frank Morrison, the business magnate, began to tell his story to a stranger on the street. He omitted names and specific details, but he spoke of betrayal, of greed, of the pain of seeing his own children conspiring against him. Martin listened in silence, nodding occasionally. When Frank finished, they remained silent for a long moment. "You know," Martin finally said, "I've learned something in these years on the street. Money, power, possessions in the end. They mean nothing if you don't have peace in your heart." Frank looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. "But," Martin continued, "I've also learned that it's never too late to start over, to rediscover what really matters." "And what is it that really matters?" Frank asked, his voice barely a whisper. Martin smiled. "That, my friend, is something each one must discover for themselves." At that moment, the sky began to clear, the first rays of sun peeking over the horizon. Frank realized he had spent the entire night talking with this stranger, who, somehow, seemed to understand him better than his own family. "I have to go," Frank said, standing up with some difficulty. "Thank you, Martin. You've given me a lot to think about." Martin nodded. "Take care. Edward. And remember, sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we really need." Frank reached into his pocket and took out the wallet he had grabbed before leaving the hospital. He extracted all the bills it contained and handed them to Martin. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." Martin looked at the bills in amazement. It's too much." "No," Frank said with a smile. "It's fair. You've given me something much more valuable tonight." With a final gesture of farewell, Frank walked away, his mind spinning with new ideas and perspectives. The encounter with Martin had been unexpected, but he felt it had been exactly what he needed. As he walked through the streets that were beginning to wake up, Frank Morrison made a decision. It was time to confront his family, to unmask the lies and greed. But he would do it, not from anger or desire for revenge, but from a place of understanding and perhaps forgiveness. The sun was rising completely over the city when Frank reached his destination, the Morrison mansion. It was time to go home and reclaim not only his empire, but also his family. The dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as Frank Morrison stood before the imposing wrought-iron gates of the family mansion. For a moment, he remained motionless, absorbing the sight of what had been his home for decades. From the outside, everything seemed the same, but Frank knew that behind those stone walls everything had changed. With a deep sigh, he pressed the doorbell. A few seconds that seemed eternal passed before a sleepy and confused voice answered through the intercom. "Who is it? Do you have any idea what time it is?" Frank recognized the voice of Thomas, the butler who had served the family for years. "It's me, Thomas Frank Morrison. Open the door, please." There was a prolonged silence, followed by the sound of the gate opening. Frank walked along the gravel path, each step resonating in the morning silence. When he reached the main door, it swung open abruptly, revealing a wide-eyed Thomas with his mouth agape in surprise. "Mr. Morrison," exclaimed the butler. "But how? We were all so worried. Your children called last night, said you had disappeared from the hospital." "I'm fine, Thomas," Frank interrupted with a tired smile. "I just needed some fresh air and time to think. Are my children home?" Thomas nodded, still stunned. "Yes, sir. They arrived last night. Very upset. I believe they're still sleeping." "Good," said Frank, entering the foyer. "Please don't tell them I'm here. Prepare coffee for everyone in the study. I'll wake them myself." As Thomas hurried to fulfill his orders, Frank slowly toured the house. Every room, every hallway was filled with memories. Here, the place where Catherine took her first steps. There, the corner where Daniel used to hide during his childhood games. And beyond, the balcony where Jessica used to spend hours reading in the summer. At what point had his children gone from being those innocent kids to the calculating adults they had become? He reached Daniel's room first. Without bothering to knock, he opened the door. His eldest son was sleeping deeply, his face finally free of the mask of worry and calculation he usually wore. For a moment, Frank saw the boy he once was. "Daniel," he called firmly, "wake up." Daniel sat up abruptly, his eyes opening in disbelief at seeing his father standing in the doorway. "Dad? But how?" "Study 10 minutes," was Frank's only response before heading to the next room. Catherine was already awake, sitting on her bed with her phone in hand. When she saw her father, the device fell from her hands. "Dad," she whispered, "we were so worried. Where have you been?" "Study 10 minutes, Frank repeated, offering no further explanation. Finally, he reached Jessica's room. His youngest daughter was sleeping curled up as she used to do as a child. For a moment, Frank felt his heart constrict. How had they come to this point? "Jessica," he called softly. "It's time to get up." Jessica slowly opened her eyes, blinking in confusion. When she focused on her father, she sat up abruptly. "Dad, is it you? Am I dreaming?" "No, you're not dreaming. Study 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, Frank Morrison was seated behind the imposing mahogany desk in the family study. In front of him, 3 steaming cups of coffee awaited his children. As they entered, one by one, with expressions ranging from confusion to fear, Frank observed them in silence. "Sit down," he finally said, his voice calm but with a tone of authority that left no room for argument. The 3 obeyed, exchanging nervous glances. "Dad," Daniel began, "what's going on? You had us worried the hospital." Frank raised a hand, silencing his eldest son. "I've spent the last 5 years listening, unable to speak. Now it's my turn to speak and yours to listen." The silence that followed was dense, charged with tension and anticipation. Frank looked each of his children in the eye before continuing. "During my time in a coma, I heard every word you said, every plan, every lie, every betrayal." His voice was calm, but each word fell like a hammer. "I saw how the empire I built became a battlefield for your ambitions. I saw how money and power corrupted the values I tried to instill in you." Catherine tried to speak, but Frank stopped her with a look. "I'm not finished last night. I left the hospital because I needed to see the world with my own eyes. I needed to remember why I built all this in the first place. And you know what I discovered? That all of this," he gestured, encompassing the luxurious room, "means nothing without integrity, without love, without family." The 3 siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jessica had tears in her eyes, Daniel was looking at the floor, and Catherine maintained a stoic expression, though her hands were shaking slightly. "But," Frank continued, his voice softening a bit, "I also realized something else. That perhaps I made mistakes too. I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot to build a family." Rising from his chair, Frank walked around the desk and approached his children. "I'm not here to punish you or to disinherit you. I'm here because I want us to have a chance to fix this, to be a real family." The 3 siblings looked up, surprised by this unexpected turn. "But," Frank added, his voice becoming firm again, That means we'll have to be completely honest with each other. I want to know everything that has happened in these 5 years. Every decision, every transaction, every lie. And from there, we'll decide, together, how to move forward. There was silence in the room as the Morrison siblings processed their father's words. Finally, it was Catherine who spoke first. "Dad," she said with a trembling voice, "there's a lot you need to know. We've made mistakes, all of us, but do you really think we can fix this?" Frank looked at his daughter, seeing for the first time in years the vulnerability behind her facade of ruthless businesswoman. "I believe," he said softly, "that if we're all willing to try, we can achieve anything." And so, as the sun rose over the city, illuminating the study through the large windows, the Morrison family began the long and difficult process of reconstruction. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many painful truths to reveal, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Frank Morrison, the man who once had it all, had returned not to reclaim his empire, but to save something much more valuable: his family. The silence that followed Frank's words was heavy, laden with pent-up emotions and truths waiting to be revealed. The 3 Morrison siblings looked at each other, as if deciding who would be the first to speak. Finally, it was Daniel who broke the silence. "Dad," he began, his voice shaky but determined, "you're right. We owe you the truth, the whole truth." Frank nodded, encouraging him to continue. Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. "When you fell into a coma, we were lost. The company was a giant, and suddenly we found ourselves at the helm without really knowing how to navigate. At first, we tried to keep everything as it was, but soon we realized that the business world doesn't wait for anyone." Catherine intervened. "We started making decisions, some good, others not so much. The sale of the technology division, for example. It was my idea. I thought we could use that capital to expand into more stable sectors." "But it wasn't just that," Jessica added, her eyes full of tears. "We started competing among ourselves. Each of us wanted to prove that we were the most capable of carrying on the Morrison legacy." Frank listened in silence, his face a mask of calm, although inside he felt a mixture of pain and disappointment. Daniel continued, I made mistakes, big mistakes. I made some risky investments without consulting anyone. We lost millions. To cover it up, I diverted funds from other parts of the company. And I found out," Catherine said, her voice cold. "But instead of exposing it, I saw an opportunity. I used that information to pressure Daniel to take more control over the main operations." Jessica, who had remained quieter until now, spoke with a broken voice. "And I was so scared of being left out, of you two taking all the control, that I started leaking information to the competition. I thought if I could prove my worth outside the company, I'd have more power inside." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, processing all this information. When he opened them, his gaze was one of deep sadness, but there was also a glimmer of determination. "I understand that you had to make difficult decisions," he finally said, "but what hurts me more are not the business mistakes. It's how you allowed ambition and fear to destroy the bonds that united us as a family." The three siblings lowered their gaze, ashamed. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was a silence of reflection and regret. Frank slowly stood up and walked to the window. He observed the mansion's garden, remembering happier times when his children played there as kids. "You know," he said without turning around, "last night I met a man who had nothing, who lived on the street, and yet he had a peace and wisdom that made me question everything I thought was important." He turned to his children. "I realized that in our pursuit of success and power, we have lost sight of what really matters: family, integrity, love." Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica listened attentively, their faces reflecting a mixture of guilt and hope. "I'm not going to lie to you," Frank continued. "I'm deeply disappointed and hurt by what you've done, but I also know that part of the responsibility is mine. I raised you to be competitive, to value success above all else. I never taught you the true value of family and cooperation." He approached his children and, to everyone's surprise, knelt in front of them, taking each one's hands. "I ask for your forgiveness," he said with a broken voice. Forgiveness for not being the father you needed, for making you believe that a person's worth is measured by their achievements and not by their heart. Tears were flowing freely down the faces of all four Morrisons. Jessica was the first to throw herself into her father's arms, quickly followed by Catherine and Daniel. For several minutes, the family remained like this, embraced, letting years of repressed emotions flow freely. When they finally separated, Frank spoke again, his voice now firm and determined. "From today on, we're going to do things differently. We're going to rebuild not just the company but our family, and we'll do it together, with honesty and transparency." "How?" Catherine asked, her voice still shaky. "To begin with," Frank replied, "we're going to review every decision, every transaction from the last 5 years. We're going to correct what can be corrected and take responsibility for what can't. If that means losing part of our fortune or facing legal consequences, so be it. Integrity has no price." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right, Dad. It's time to face the consequences of our actions." "But you won't do it alone," Frank added. "I'll be with you every step of the way. Together, we'll find a way to make things right." Jessica, wiping away her tears, spoke with determination. "I want to help. I want to use my skills for something good, to rebuild what I helped damage." Catherine, always the strategist, was already thinking about the next steps. "We'll need a team of independent auditors, trusted lawyers. It will be a long and difficult process." Frank smiled, proud to see his children taking responsibility. "That's right. It won't be easy, and there will be times when we'll want to give up. But if we stick together, if we support each other, we can overcome any obstacle." He stood up and walked to his desk. From one of the drawers, he took out an old photo album. He opened it and showed his children a photograph of when they were little, all smiling on a beach. "I want us to remember who we were," he said softly, "and who we can be again. A united family, supporting each other through good times and bad." The four Morrisons looked at the photograph, remembering simpler and happier times. At that moment, each of them made a silent promise to fight, not just for the future of the company, but for the future of their family. Frank closed the album and looked at his children with determination. "Well, it's time to get to work. We have a lot to do and a long road ahead, but we'll do it together, step by step." And so, as the sun rose in the sky, illuminating the study with a hopeful light, the Morrison family began their journey of redemption and reconstruction. They knew they would face challenges, that there would be difficult days ahead, but for the first time in years, they faced the future united, with a common purpose and a renewed sense of what really matters in life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity in the Morrison mansion. Frank, true to his word, immersed himself fully in the process of unraveling the complex web of decisions and transactions that had occurred during his absence. The study, which was once Frank's private sanctuary, became the operations center. Mountains of documents covered every available surface, and a team of auditors and lawyers came and went constantly, working tirelessly to uncover the full truth of what had happened to the Morrison empire. Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica worked side by side with their father, each facing their own demons, as more details of their past actions came to light one morning. While reviewing reports from the International Division, Daniel heavily dropped a stack of papers on the desk. "Dad," he said with a trembling voice, "there's something else you need to know, something I haven't told anyone, not even Catherine and Jessica." Frank looked up from the documents he was reviewing, his gaze full of concern but also support. "I'm listening, son." Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. 3 years ago, when things started to go wrong with my investments, I did something unforgivable. I used insider information to make some transactions. I made millions, but it was illegal. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine and Jessica looked at their brother with a mixture of shock and disappointment. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, processing this new information. When he opened them, his gaze was firm but compassionate. "Thank you for your honesty, Daniel. I know it must not have been easy to admit this, but now that we know, we can face it." He turned to the lead lawyer, who had been listening silently. "What are our options?" The lawyer, a middle-aged man with thin-framed glasses, spoke in a grave tone. "Mr. Morrison, insider. Trading is a serious crime. The consequences can include substantial fines and even prison time. However, given that Daniel is admitting this voluntarily, we could negotiate with the authorities to mitigate the consequences." Daniel paled at the mention of prison, but nodded with determination. "I'll do whatever is necessary to correct this. I'm willing to face the consequences of my actions." Frank stood up and put a hand on his eldest son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Daniel. It takes courage to admit mistakes and be willing to face them. You won't be alone in this. We'll face this as a family." Catherine, who had been unusually silent, finally spoke. "I also have something to confess. The offshore companies I mentioned before, they weren't just for diversification. I used them to evade taxes and hide some questionable transactions." Jessica, not wanting to be left behind in this moment of truths, added, The leaks to the competition were more extensive than I initially admitted. I practically handed over some of our most innovative projects." Frank looked at his 3 children, his heart heavy but full of a strange pride. Despite the gravity of their confessions, they were showing a courage and honesty he hadn't seen in years. "Well," he finally said, "now that everything is on the table, we can really start to fix things. It won't be easy. There will be consequences, some of them severe, but we'll face them together with integrity and determination." He turned to the legal and financial team. "I want a complete plan on how we're going to address each of these issues. I want options to make things right, even if it means losing a significant portion of our fortune. The integrity of this family and our legacy is more important than any amount of money." The following days were intense. The Morrison family worked tirelessly with their legal team to develop an action plan. They decided to proactively approach regulatory authorities, offering full cooperation in exchange for some leniency. The news that the Morrison empire was under investigation didn't take long to reach the media. Overnight, the family that was once admired became the center of a financial scandal. But in the midst of the media storm, something unexpected began to happen. The honesty and transparency with which the family was handling the situation began to gain the respect of many. Frank, in particular, was praised for his ethical leadership at a time when many others would have tried to cover up the truth. One afternoon, as the family gathered to discuss the latest developments, Frank shared an idea he had been considering. "I've been thinking," he began, "about how we can use this experience for something positive. What do you think if, once we've resolved our legal problems, we use our resources and experience to help other companies operate with greater ethics and transparency?" Catherine's eyes lit up. "We could create a foundation," she suggested, "one dedicated to promoting ethical business practices and helping troubled companies recover in an integral way." "I like that idea," Daniel added. "We could offer advice, resources, use our own lessons learned to prevent others from making the same mistakes." Jessica, always thinking about public image, chimed in. "And we could organize conferences, write books, really make a difference in business culture." Frank smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart as he saw his children working together, using their talents for something positive. "Then it's decided, once we've put our house in order, that will be our next project." As the Morrison family continued on their path of redemption, facing each challenge with honesty and unity, they began to discover a profound truth, that true wealth is not measured in bank accounts or properties, but in integrity, family love, and the ability to make a positive difference in the world. The Morrison Empire might have been shaken to its foundations, but from its ruins, something much more valuable was emerging. A united family, determined to use their influence and resources for the common good. And in that shared purpose, they found a satisfaction that no material wealth could match. The following months were a period of intense activity for the Morrison family. The process of facing the consequences of their past actions was arduous and often painful. There were days when the weight of their mistakes seemed overwhelming, but they remained united, supporting each other in the most difficult moments. Daniel, true to his word, turned himself into the authorities to face charges for insider trading. Thanks to his voluntary cooperation and the tireless work of his legal team, he managed to reach an agreement that included a substantial fine and community service instead of prison time. Catherine worked diligently to unravel the complex network of offshore companies and questionable transactions she had created. The process was long and complicated, but with the help of financial and legal experts, she managed to rectify most of the irregularities, albeit at a significant financial cost to the company. Jessica, for her part, dedicated herself to repairing the damage caused by her leaks to the competition. She worked tirelessly to recover lost projects and restore the trust of business partners who had been affected by her actions. Frank oversaw the entire process, offering support and guidance to his children while also dealing with the press and shareholders. His honesty and transparency in handling the crisis began to bear fruit. Although the value of Morrison Enterprises shares had initially fallen, the integrity shown by the family in managing the crisis began to gradually restore public confidence. One afternoon, as the family gathered for their now usual dinner together, Frank proposed a toast. "To the Morrison family," he said, raising his glass, "we have fallen, but we have risen stronger and more united than ever." The others raised their glasses, their faces reflecting a mixture of weariness and determination. "Dad," Catherine said after a moment of silence, "do you remember the foundation idea we discussed a few months ago? I think it's time to set it in motion." Frank nodded, a smile forming on his lips. "I agree. What do you have in mind?" For the next few hours, the dining table became an impromptu boardroom. The four Morrisons passionately discussed their ideas for the foundation, each contributing their unique expertise and perspective. "We should focus on ethical business education," Daniel suggested. "Use our experience to teach future business leaders about the importance of integrity in business." Catherine nodded enthusiastically. "And we could offer mentoring programs for young companies, helping them grow in a sustainable and ethical manner." "Let's not forget the importance of transparency," Jessica added. "We could develop tools and protocols to help companies be more open and accountable in their operations." Frank listened with pride as his children transformed their past mistakes into valuable lessons for others. "It sounds excellent," he said, "but I think we should go a step further. What do you think about also including programs to help disadvantaged people start their own businesses?" The eyes of the three siblings lit up at the suggestion. "That's brilliant, Dad," Jessica exclaimed. "We could offer microloans, training, and legal and financial advice," Catherine added. "We could even create a network of volunteer mentors among our business contacts," Daniel suggested. And so at that dining table, the Morrison Foundation for Business Ethics and Economic Empowerment was born. In the months that followed, the family worked tirelessly to make their vision a reality. The foundation quickly became a beacon of hope and change in the business world. It offered ethical education programs for business students, advice for companies seeking to improve their practices, and support for entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities. A year after the launch of the foundation, the Morrison family organized a large charity gala to celebrate its achievements and raise funds for future projects. The event attracted business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists from across the country. Frank, standing at the podium to give the opening speech, looked at the audience and then at his children, seated in the front row. His heart swelled with pride and gratitude. "Just over a year ago," he began, "the Morrison family was at the lowest point in its history. We had lost our way, forgetting the fundamental values that should guide not only our business but our lives. But in that moment of darkness, we rediscovered something precious: the power of family, the importance of integrity, and the capacity for redemption. That we all carry within us." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "The Morrison Foundation was born from that experience. It's not just an attempt to amend our mistakes, but a commitment to create a more ethical, fairer, and more inclusive business world. Because we have learned that true success is not measured in dollars and cents, but in the positive impact we can have on the lives of others." As Frank continued his speech, Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica looked at him with a mixture of admiration and love. Each of them had traveled a long and difficult path of self-reflection and growth. They had faced their mistakes, accepted the consequences, and in the process had rediscovered themselves and each other. The Morrison family had been forged anew in the fire of adversity, emerging stronger, more united, and with a renewed purpose. Their story of fall and redemption had become a source of inspiration for many, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path towards light if one has the courage to seek it. As the gala continued, with guests animatedly discussing the Foundation's projects and making generous donations, the four Morrisons shared a look of complicity. They had lost an empire, but they had gained something much more valuable, a united family and a legacy they could truly be proud of. The Morrison Foundation for Business Ethics and Economic Empowerment was in full swing. Its programs had helped hundreds of companies adopt more ethical practices and had boosted dozens of entrepreneurs from disadvantaged communities. The Morrison family, once embroiled in scandals, was now seen as an example of redemption and corporate social responsibility. However, fate had an unexpected twist in store for the family one spring morning. As Frank was enjoying his morning coffee in the mansion's garden, Thomas, the loyal butler, approached with a look of concern on his face. "Mr. Morrison," he said with a trembling voice, "there's someone at the door who insists on seeing you. He says it's urgent." Frank frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors so early. "Who is it?" "I don't know, sir. It's a man. He appears to be homeless. He says he knows you." Frank's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? "Show him in, Thomas. I'll receive him here." Moments later, a disheveled but kind-looking man entered the garden. Frank recognized him immediately. It was Martin, the man he had talked to that night outside the hospital. "Martin!" Frank exclaimed, standing up to greet him. "What a surprise. Please sit down. How did you find me?" Martin smiled shyly as he took a seat. "It wasn't difficult, Mr. Morrison. Your face has been in all the newspapers lately. When I saw the photos, I recognized the man who sat with me on the curb that night." Frank nodded, remembering how he had given Martin a false name. "I'm sorry for deceiving you that night. Martin raised a hand to interrupt him. "There's no need to apologize. I understand why you did it, but I haven't come here to talk about the past." "Then?" Frank asked, intrigued. Martin took a deep breath before continuing. "Mr. Morrison, I need your help. Not for me, but for the homeless community I'm part of." Frank listened attentively as Martin explained the situation. The shelter where many of them found refuge was about to close due to lack of funds. Dozens of people would be left on the street if that happened. "I know it's a lot to ask," Martin concluded, "but you were kind to me that night. I thought maybe your foundation could help us." Frank remained silent for a moment, processing the information. Then a smile spread across his face. "Martin, we're not just going to help. I think this could be the beginning of something much bigger." That same afternoon, Frank called an emergency family meeting. When Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica gathered in the study, he introduced them to Martin and told them the story of their encounter that night outside the hospital. "Kids," Frank said, his voice full of emotion, "I think we've found our next big project." Over the next few hours, the Morrison family worked with Martin to develop an ambitious plan. They would not only save the shelter, but create a comprehensive program to address the problem of homelessness in the city. Catherine suggested a job training program to help people reintegrate into the workforce. Daniel proposed partnerships with local businesses to offer employment opportunities. Jessica developed a communication strategy to raise awareness about the issue and attract more support. Martin watched in amazement as his concerns were transformed into a concrete action plan. It's more than I could have imagined," he said with tears in his eyes. Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "Martin, that night you taught me an invaluable lesson about true wealth and humanity. It's time we return that favor." In the months that followed, Project Renaissance, as they called it, became the Morrison Foundation's flagship initiative. The shelter was not only saved but expanded and improved. Training programs, mental health services, and job counseling were established. The Morrison family became personally involved in the project. Daniel taught personal finance classes. Catherine advised on professional skills, And Jessica organized fundraising events that attracted the city's elite. A year after the start of the project, the Morrison Foundation organized a grand celebration at the renovated shelter. Frank, standing next to Martin, proudly watched as hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed by the project shared their stories. "You know, Martin," Frank said quietly, "when I built my empire, I thought I had reached the pinnacle of success, but now I realize that this is true success." Martin nodded, a smile on his face. And to think it all started with a simple conversation on a curb. As the celebration continued around them, Frank reflected on the incredible journey his family had undertaken, from greed to redemption, from material success to true purpose, and at the center of it all, a lesson he had learned from a homeless man on a dark night: that true wealth is found in the positive impact we can have on the lives of others. The story of the Morrison family, once a tale of greed and betrayal, had transformed into a saga of redemption, family unity, and service to the community. And as Frank looked at his children, working side by side with the people they were helping, he knew that this was the legacy he had always dreamed of leaving, though he had never known it until now. Time passed, and the Morrison Foundation became a beacon of hope and change in the city. Project Renaissance had been just the beginning. As its impact grew, so did the Morrison family's vision for a better future. 5 years after that fateful night, when Frank awoke from his coma, the family gathered once again in the mansion's study. This time not to face a crisis, but to celebrate and reflect on the journey they had taken. Frank, now with completely white hair but with a renewed vitality in his eyes, looked at his children with pride. Daniel, once obsessed with power and money, now directed financial education programs for low-income communities. Catherine, who previously used her cunning to manipulate numbers, now applied that same intelligence to develop sustainable business models for social enterprises. And Jessica, whose talent for communication was once used to deceive, was now the passionate voice inspiring others to join their cause. "My dear children," Frank began, his voice full of emotion, "5 years ago, I thought I had lost everything, my empire, my legacy, even my faith in you. But now I realize that loss was actually the beginning of something much more valuable." Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica listened attentively, their eyes shining with a mixture of love and respect for their father. "We have built something much more important than a business empire," Frank continued. "We have built a legacy of compassion, integrity, and service, and we've done it together as a family." Catherine was the first to speak. "Dad, you showed us the way, your strength and your willingness to forgive us and give us a second chance that changed everything." Daniel nodded. "It's true, I remember when I was willing to do anything for money and power. Now every time I see someone whose life we've helped improve, I feel a satisfaction that no bank account could match." Jessica, with tears in her eyes, added, "And to think it all started with a conversation with a stranger on the street. Martin taught us so much without even knowing it." Frank smiled. Remembering his friend Martin, although no longer living on the streets thanks to Project Renaissance, remained an invaluable advisor to the foundation, providing the unique perspective of someone who had lived the experience of homelessness. "Speaking of Martin," Frank said, "I have a surprise for you. I've been thinking about the future of the foundation, about how to ensure our work continues even when we're no longer here." The three siblings leaned forward, intrigued. "I've decided," Frank continued, "that when the time comes, the direction of the foundation will pass to a board formed by people who have been benefited by our programs, people like Martin, who understand firsthand the needs of those we serve." There was a moment of silence as the siblings processed this information. Then, to Frank's surprise, they burst into applause and exclamations of approval. "It's brilliant, Dad," Catherine exclaimed. "Who better to lead the foundation than those whose lives it has changed?" Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "It ensures that the original spirit of the foundation stays alive. And it gives us the opportunity to continue learning from those we serve." Jessica, added Frank, felt his heart swell with pride and love for his children. They had come a long way from those dark days of greed and mistrust. "There's something else," Frank said, his voice becoming softer. "I've been thinking about our last name, about the Morrison legacy. The three siblings tensed, slightly, remembering how that same surname had been associated with scandals and corruption not long ago. "I propose," Frank continued, "that we change the name of the foundation. Instead of the Morrison Foundation, we could call it the Renaissance Foundation. Because that's what it represents, a renaissance of values, of purpose, of humanity." His children's eyes lit up with the idea. "I love it," Jessica said. "It perfectly captures the essence of what we do. And it allows us to leave the past behind," Daniel added, "while honoring the path that brought us here." Catherine, always the most pragmatic, was already thinking about the details. "We'll have to carefully plan the transition, of course, but I think this change could open even more doors for our work." Frank smiled, feeling a deep peace in his heart. "Then it's decided. The Renaissance Foundation will be our legacy to the world." Rising from his chair, Frank walked to the study window. The sun was setting over the city, bathing the horizon in golden and pink hues. In the distance, he could see the buildings of downtown, where his business empire had once reigned. "You know," he said softly, "there was a time when I believed those skyscrapers were the pinnacle of success. Now I realize that true success is not measured by the height of our buildings, but by the depth of our impact on the lives of others." He turned to his children. Extending his arms, Daniel, Catherine, and Jessica stood up and joined him in a group hug, something they hadn't done in years. "I'm so proud of you," Frank murmured, his voice laden with emotion, "of who you were, who you are, and who you will continue to be." As the Morrison family remained united, contemplating the sunset and the bright future that stretched before them, Frank reflected on the incredible journey they had undertaken, from greed to compassion, from selfishness to service, from an empire of material wealth to a legacy of spiritual richness. And at that moment, Frank Morrison knew with certainty that he had found something much more valuable than any fortune. He had found the true purpose of his life and that of his family. The story of the Morrisons, once a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed, had transformed into a beacon of hope and redemption. And as the sun set on this new era of their lives, Frank knew that the real work was just beginning. But this time, they would face the future not as individuals hungry for power, but as a united family dedicated to making the world a better place. The Morrison Empire had fallen, but from its ashes had risen something infinitely more valuable, a legacy of love, compassion, and service that would endure far longer than any material fortune.